October 10th, 1943, 27,000 feet above Münster, Germany. Captain Robert Johnson pulled his P-47 Thunderbolt into a shallow climb, scanning the sky above for the enemy fighters he knew were coming. The bombers he was escorting, flying fortresses of the 8th Air Force, droned steadily toward their target, black puffs of flak beginning to bracket their formations. Then he saw them, 40 German fighters diving toward the bombers from above, Messerschmitt Bf 100s and Focke-Wulf 190s positioning for attack runs. Johnson's squadron commander called the bounce, and the American pilots responded according to the doctrine they had been training for 6 months. But Johnson did something different. Instead of turning toward the threat, instead of trying to climb to intercept, he rolled his massive fighter onto its back and pulled the nose through toward the earth. The Thunderbolt accelerated, 400 miles per hour, 450, 470. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The engine screamed at full throttle as Johnson dove nearly vertical through 20,000 feet of cold October sky. The German fighters below him never saw it coming. Johnson leveled out beneath a climbing Messerschmitt Bf 110, its twin engines pulling a hapless bomber-destroyer upward. He fired. 8 50-caliber machine guns erupted for 3 seconds. The German aircraft exploded. Before enemy pilots could react, Johnson was already pulling up, using the tremendous speed from his dive to zoom climb back to altitude, energy converting to height as his P-47 rocketed upward through 15,000 feet. By the time the German formation could reorient, Johnson was back at combat altitude with his flight, ready to dive again. That day, Johnson would shoot down the Messerschmitt and an escorting Focke-Wulf 190. He would become an ace, and he would demonstrate the tactical doctrine that would transform the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt from a problematic and failure into the most successful American fighter in the European theater. The technique was called boom and zoom. But calling it a technique understates what it represented. This was a complete reconception of fighter combat, built around a single counterintuitive truth. The P-47 Thunderbolt could not turn with German fighters. It could not climb with them. At low altitude, it accelerated slowly and maneuvered like a freight train. By every conventional measure of fighter performance, it should have been slaughtered over Europe. But the P-47 could dive faster than any fighter in the sky, and from 28,000 feet, diving at speeds approaching 550 miles per hour, it became the most lethal interceptor in the war. This is the story of how American pilots learned to turn the Thunderbolt's greatest weakness into its defining strength, how engineering limitations forced tactical innovation, and how one man's determination to exploit dive performance created a combat doctrine that would destroy more than 3,800 German aircraft and help achieve air superiority over Europe. The mathematics of high-speed diving were being written not in wind tunnels, but in the desperate improvisation of combat pilots who discovered that survival required unlearning everything they thought they knew about dogfighting. The conventional was about to become obsolete, and the teacher was a 33-year-old major from Montana who had watched Royal Air Force pilots die trying to climb with German fighters and decided there had to be a better way. That path began 18 months earlier, in a factory on Long Island, January 15, 1942, Republic Aviation Corporation, Farmingdale, New York. The XP-47B prototype sat on the concrete apron outside Republic's main facility, its massive bulk dwarfing every other fighter on the field. At 12,600 pounds fully loaded, the Thunderbolt was nearly twice the weight of a Spitfire. Its 40-foot wingspan carried 300 square feet of wing area. The nose housed a Pratt & Whitney R 2,800 double wasp radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower. Behind the cockpit, a complex turbocharging system forced compressed air through intercoolers and into the engine, allowing full power at altitudes above 30,000 feet. The system required ducting that snaked through the rear fuselage, air intakes under the cowling, exhaust pipes running along both sides of the cockpit to the turbocharger mounted in the aft fuselage. The weight penalty was enormous. The performance advantage at altitude was undeniable, Alexander Kartveli, Republic's chief designer, had created the P-47 inches response to combat reports from Europe, suggesting that high-altitude performance would determine air superiority. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 could reach 35,000 feet. British fighters struggled above 25,000 feet. American bombers would operate at altitudes where oxygen masks and heated flight suits were mandatory. Kartveli designed the Thunderbolt to dominate that environment. At 30,000 feet, where thin air starved normally aspirated engines, the R2800's turbocharger delivered sea-level manifold pressure. Power output remained nearly constant. While enemy fighters gasped for air, the P-47 maintained full throttle. But every engineering decision created trade-offs. The turbocharger system added weight. The radial engine required a large cowling that increased frontal area. The massive fuselage created drag. The wing loading, weight divided by wing area, exceeded 40 pounds per square foot, highest of any American fighter. High wing loading meant slow acceleration, poor climb rate, sluggish turning at combat speeds. Test pilots at Wright Field evaluated the XP-47B through spring 1942. Their reports praised high-altitude performance and structural strength. They noted excellent dive characteristics. They documented serious problems with climbing performance and maneuverability. At low to medium altitude, the Thunderbolt wallowed. German fighters would outclimb, outturn, and out-accelerate the big American fighter in any conventional dogfight. The Army Air Forces had already ordered production. 1,300 aircraft would be delivered before mid-1943. Fighter groups would transition from P-42s and P-39s to Thunderbolts, beginning in summer 1942. Combat deployment to England would begin early 1943. There was no time to redesign the aircraft. The P-47 would go to war with the performance characteristics it had. Success would depend on developing tactics that exploited strengths and avoided weaknesses. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke received that assignment on September 16, 1942. Age 29, Zemke had served as an observer with the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain. He had watched Hurricanes and Spitfires engage Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 190s. He understood what worked and what failed in modern air combat. When he took command of the 56th Fighter Group at Bradley Field, Connecticut, Zemke inherited 3 squadrons equipped with P-47C Thunderbolts. The pilots came from varied backgrounds. Some had trained on P-42s and expected a nimble fighter. Others had flown bombers and were transitioning to single-seat operations. Few had combat experience. None understood how to fight effectively in an aircraft that contradicted every tactical doctrine taught in flight school. Traditional fighter tactics emphasized turning fights. A pilot with better turn performance could get inside an enemy's turning circle, position for a firing solution, and destroy the opponent before being hit himself. American doctrine emphasized formation integrity and mutual support, but assumed that when combat began, individual pilots would engage enemies in turning dogfights. The P-47 could not dogfight successfully. Any Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf pilot who forced a Thunderbolt into a turning engagement would win. German pilots knew this. Intelligence reports from captured Luftwaffe documents showed that German tactical instructions specifically recommended drawing American heavy fighters into slow-speed turning fights, where German aircraft held overwhelming advantages. Zemke understood that sending his pilots into combat with conventional tactics would result in catastrophic losses. He needed a different approach. Through late 1942, as the 56th Fighter Group trained at Bradley Field and then Bridgeport, Connecticut, Zemke developed the tactical doctrine that would define P-47 operations throughout the war. The solution was energy fighting. Rather than turning to outmaneuver opponents, American pilots would use vertical tactics, trading altitude for speed in dives, then converting that speed back into altitude in zoom climbs. The Thunderbolt's excellent dive performance became the foundation for all tactics. Energy fighting was not new. German pilots had used similar tactics during the Battle of Britain, diving from altitude onto British fighters climbing to meet bomber formations. The difference was scale. German fighters could dive quickly, but they also turned well enough to engage in conventional dogfights when necessary. The P-47 had no such flexibility. Dive and zoom attacks were not an option. They were the only viable tactic. Zemke drilled his pilots relentlessly. Formations would patrol at maximum altitude, typically 28,000 to 32,000 feet. When enemy fighters appeared below, American flights would dive to attack, using speed to position for firing runs. After shooting, regardless of results, pilots would continue their dives to build even more speed, then pull into steep zoom climbs that carried them back to altitude. German pilots attempting to follow would find themselves unable to match the P-47's dive acceleration. The Thunderbolt's weight, its greatest liability in climbing fights, became its greatest asset in dives. Gravity pulled the massive fighter earthward with tremendous force. Wind resistance increased with the square of velocity, but the P-47's structural strength allowed it to reach speeds where lighter aircraft would break apart. The dive limit for the P-47C was 500 miles per hour indicated airspeed. At high altitude, where air density was lower, this translated to true airspeeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. At these velocities, German fighters experienced severe control difficulties. The Messerschmitt Bf 109's controls stiffened dramatically above 400 miles per hour. Aileron response disappeared. Pilots attempting high-speed dives often lost control or experienced structural failures. The Focke-Wulf 190 handled better at high speeds, but still could not match the Thunderbolt's terminal velocity. And critically, neither German fighter could safely maintain the speeds necessary to keep pace with a diving P-47. American pilots learned to initiate dives from altitude, knowing that once accelerated past 450 miles per hour, they were effectively untouchable. The zoom climb after an attack run was equally important. The tremendous kinetic energy built during the dive, when converted to potential energy through a climb, would carry the P-47 back to altitude faster than its normal climb rate suggested possible. A pilot diving from 30,000 feet to 15,000 feet at 500 miles per hour, then pulling into a maximum performance zoom climb, could regain 25,000 feet altitude before speed decayed below fighting velocity. German pilots watching this maneuver found it baffling. The Thunderbolt appeared to defy physics, plummeting from altitude, attacking, then rocketing back upward faster than it had descended. Luftwaffe tactical instructions from late 1943 warned pilots that American P-47 seconds could not be caught in vertical combat, and recommended avoiding engagements unless holding significant altitude or energy advantages. But developing effective tactics required understanding aircraft performance at the edges of the flight envelope. The P-47 had a dangerous characteristic that killed multiple pilots before engineers and test pilots developed procedures to manage it. At high speeds, the aircraft experienced compressibility. Compressibility occurred when airflow over the wings approached the speed of sound. At approximately 75% of the speed of sound, shock waves formed on the wing's upper surface. These shock waves disrupted smooth airflow, causing several problems. Drag increased dramatically. Lift decreased. Most critically, the wing's aerodynamic center shifted rearward, creating a strong nose-down pitching moment. For the P-47 pilot, compressibility manifested as violent buffeting beginning around 550 miles per hour indicated airspeed at altitude. The control stick shook so severely that it required both hands to maintain grip. Then, suddenly, the buffeting stopped and the stick froze solid, immovable regardless of how much force the pilot applied. Simultaneously, the aircraft's nose pitched down sharply. Without elevator control, the pilot could not arrest the dive. The P-47 would accelerate even faster, increasing the severity of the compressibility effect. Several early Thunderbolts dove into the ground with pilots frantically pulling back on controls that had no effect. The solution came through systematic testing at high altitude. Test pilots at Republic and Wright Field developed recovery procedures through trial and error. The key was understanding that compressibility was speed-dependent. If the aircraft could be slowed below the critical Mach number, normal control would return. But how could a pilot slow an aircraft when the controls did not respond? The answer was throttle management and time. By reducing throttle to idle, the pilot eliminated engine thrust that was contributing to acceleration. Wind resistance alone would gradually slow the aircraft, even in a vertical dive. If sufficient altitude remained, the aircraft would eventually decelerate below the compressibility threshold, usually around 500 miles per hour indicated airspeed. At that point, buffeting would resume briefly, then subside as speed decreased further. Control response would return gradually. The pilot could begin pulling out of the dive, gently at first to avoid overstressing the airframe at high speed, then more aggressively as speed continued to decay. The procedure required discipline and altitude. Pilots who panicked and attempted to force controls, or who waited too long to begin recovery, would die. Those who followed the procedure survived, though they often described the experience as terrifying. The aircraft would drop through 10,000 feet or more in complete compressibility, nose pointed nearly straight down, controls frozen, buffeting so violent it seemed the aircraft would disintegrate. Then, gradually, control would return. The stick would move slightly. Pressure on the elevators would begin taking effect. The nose would slowly lift toward the horizon. By the time the aircraft reached level flight, it might be only 5,000 feet above ground, but it would be flying normally again. Colonel Hubert Zemke made certain every pilot in the 56th Fighter Group understood compressibility recovery before deploying to England. He organized high-altitude training flights specifically to allow pilots to experience the onset of compressibility in controlled conditions. Pilots would climb above 35,000 feet, roll inverted, and pull through into vertical dives. They would watch their airspeed indicators climb past 450, then 500 miles per hour. They would feel the buffeting, begin, experience the stick freezing, feel the aircraft's nose tuck down sharply. Then they would reduce throttle, wait, and trust the procedure as the aircraft accelerated through 550 miles per hour and beyond. Most importantly, they would learn the altitude required. A pilot entering compressibility at 35,000 feet had sufficient margin to recover above 10,000 feet. A pilot entering compressibility at 25,000 feet might recover only a few thousand feet above terrain. Below 20,000 feet, compressibility was fatal, unless the pilot had exceptional luck or extraordinary skill. This training saved lives. When the 56th Fighter Group deployed to England in January 1943, its pilots understood their aircraft better than any other P-47 unit. They knew the Thunderbolt could not dogfight. They knew it could dive faster than any enemy fighter. They knew how to recover from compressibility, and they were about to prove that these capabilities could change the air war over Europe. January 13, 1943. The 56th Fighter Group arrived at RAF King's Cliff without their aircraft. The P-47C Thunderbolts would arrive by ship later. For 2 weeks, pilots and ground crews waited in the cold English winter, occupying themselves with briefings, physical training, and getting acquainted with the local pubs. The Thunderbolts arrived on January 24th. Within days, the group relocated to RAF Horsham St Faith, near Norwich, and began combat operations. The first missions were fighter sweeps over France and the Low Countries, designed to draw Luftwaffe fighters into combat while allowing American pilots to gain experience in hostile airspace. The missions were called rodeos. No bombers to escort, just fighter versus fighter engagements to learn the enemy's capabilities and test American tactics. April 8, 1943. The 56th Fighter Group flew its first rodeo, 48 P-47Cs, crossed the English Channel at 28,000 feet, maintaining tight formation as they approached the French coast near Dunkirk. Zemke led from the front, scanning constantly for enemy fighters. The Germans did not appear. The American formation flew inland to Ypres, then turned northwest toward the coast. Still no contact. The mission ended without engagement. American fighters crossed the channel at high altitude. Luftwaffe controllers tracked them on radar but did not scramble fighters. German pilots had learned from 2 years of combat that engaging British fighters at high altitude was costly. Better to wait until British fighters descended or ran low on fuel than attack on terms favourable to German aircraft. The 8th Air Force bomber offensive complicated German calculations. When flying fortresses and liberators struck targets in France and Germany, Luftwaffe fighters had no choice but to engage. The bombers had to be stopped, and when German fighters climbed to attack bomber formations, American escort fighters could engage from altitude. May 14, 1943, the 56th Fighter Group escorted bombers attacking Antwerp, Belgium. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. As B-17 seconds approached their target at 24,000 feet, German fighters rose to intercept. Focke-Wulf, 190s from JG-26, one of the Luftwaffe's elite units, dove through the bomber formation, attacking with cannon fire, then pulling up to reposition for second passes. Zemke's pilots responded exactly as trained. Instead of chasing the diving German fighters, they maintained altitude. When the Focke-Wulfs pulled up from their attack runs, climbing back toward the bombers, they were slow, vulnerable, presenting perfect targets for American fighters diving from above. Zemke led the attack. He rolled his P-47 inverted and pulled through, diving nearly vertical toward a climbing WWII. His airspeed built rapidly. 400 miles per hour. 430. 460. The German pilot saw him too late. Zemke fired a 3-second burst from 400 yards. The Focke-Wulf's left wing folded upward, ripped away by cannon shells from the P-47's 850 caliber machine guns. The German aircraft tumbled into the clouds, trailing smoke. Other American pilots repeated the attack. Dive from altitude. Accelerate to speeds German fighters could not match. Position behind climbing or slow-moving enemies. Fire. Then continue the dive to build more speed. Pull into a zoom climb back to altitude. Repeat. The 56th Fighter Group claimed 7 German aircraft destroyed that day without losing a single Thunderbolt. The tactical advantage was overwhelming. German pilots found themselves in an impossible situation. To attack the bombers, they had to climb to operational altitude. While climbing, they were vulnerable to diving American fighters. If they dove away to escape, P-47 seconds simply followed, matching their dive speed and often exceeding it. If they tried to turn and fight, they found American fighters zooming back to altitude before they could complete their turns. The Luftwaffe had encountered energy tactics before. Their own pilots used diving attacks routinely, but they had never faced an opponent who could dive so fast that escape became impossible, and who could zoom climb so effectively that pursuit was futile. The P-47's weight, which made it sluggish in turning fights, made it unstoppable in vertical combat. June 13, 1943. The tactical doctrine received its most dramatic validation. The 56th Fighter Group flew bomber escort to Lille, France. Over the target area, German fighters engaged in force. Zemke spotted 4 Focke-Wulf 190s at 20,000 feet, below his formation, flying at 27,000 feet. He dove with his flight. The dive was nearly vertical. Zemke's airspeed indicator passed 450 miles per hour, then 500. The Focke-Wulfs scattered as they realized American fighters were on them, but too late. Zemke fired at the trailing enemy aircraft. Cannon shells raked the WWII-190's engine. Smoke erupted from the cowling. The German fighter rolled inverted and dove toward the ground. Zemke did not follow. He pulled out of his dive at high speed, converting velocity into a zoom climb that carried him back through 25,000 feet. Within 30 seconds of starting his attack, he was back at combat altitude, ready to attack again. He had just demonstrated that the P-47 could attack, destroy an enemy, and regain position faster than German fighters could react. That day, Zemke claimed 2 Focke-Wulf 190s. The group claimed 6 enemy aircraft destroyed. More importantly, word spread through the 8th Air Force that the 56th had developed tactics that worked. Other P-47 groups began adopting similar approaches. The Thunderbolt's reputation began to change from problematic heavyweight to effective fighter, but the ultimate test came when young pilots, trained in the tactical doctrine but not yet hardened by combat experience, proved they could execute dive attacks even when everything went wrong. June 26, 1943. Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson flew his 13th combat mission. Age 23, from Lawton, Oklahoma, Johnson had joined the 56th Fighter Group as a replacement pilot after the unit deployed to England. He was still learning combat procedures, still flying as wingman in the 61st Fighter Squadron. The mission was bomber escort to Villacoublay Airfield near Paris. 48 P-47Cs departed RAF Manston in late afternoon, climbing to altitude as they crossed the English Channel. Weather was clear, visibility unlimited, perfect conditions for combat. As the formation approached the rendezvous point near Forges-les-Eaux, German fighters attacked from above and behind. 16 Focke-Wulf, 190s from JG-26, the unit's most experienced pilots, executed a perfectly timed bounce. The first pass scattered the American formation. In seconds, the organized defensive formation dissolved into individual dogfights. Johnson found himself alone at the rear of the formation. A Focke-Wulf positioned behind him. Johnson saw tracers flash past his canopy. Then something hit. The cockpit exploded in a shower of hydraulic fluid and perspex fragments. A 20mm cannon shell had struck just behind the cockpit, rupturing hydraulic lines. Fluid sprayed across the windscreen, blinding Johnson. His right leg burned where shrapnel had cut through his flight suit. Blood ran down his face from a bullet graze across his nose. The P-47 spun. Johnson fought the controls, unable to see, working by instinct and training. He kicked left rudder to level the wings, pulled back on the stick to recover from the spin. The aircraft responded sluggishly. Hydraulics failed, but the mechanical linkages still functioned. Johnson leveled out, pulled the canopy jettison handle. The canopy did not move. It was jammed. He was trapped in a damaged fighter over enemy territory, unable to bail out. The only option was to fly back to England. Johnson pushed the throttle forward and pointed the nose toward the channel. His airspeed was low, around 250 miles per hour. Fuel was leaking, but engine temperature remained normal. He might make it. Then another Focke-Wulf appeared. Johnson saw the enemy fighter position behind him, perhaps 600 yards back. The German pilot was Oberst Egon Meyer, commander of JG-2, one of the Luftwaffe's most successful aces with 57 kills. Meyer had expended his cannon ammunition shooting down a B-17. He began firing machine guns at Johnson's crippled Thunderbolt. Johnson could not turn to evade. He could not dive away at low altitude. He could not accelerate with his damaged aircraft. He could only fly straight toward England and hope the P-47's armor held. Machine gun bullets stitched across the Thunderbolt's fuselage. Metal panels peeled back, instruments shattered. The armor plate behind Johnson's seat rang like a bell as bullets impacted. Meyer expended his machine gun ammunition. The German pilot pulled alongside Johnson's battered fighter, close enough that Johnson could see his face. For several seconds the two pilots flew wingtip to wingtip. Then Meyer rocked his wings in salute to a brave opponent and peeled away. Johnson continued across the channel alone. He reached the English coast with fuel gauges showing nearly empty. RAF Manston appeared ahead. Johnson lowered landing gear manually, pumping the emergency extension handle. The wheels locked down. He had no hydraulic brakes, no flaps. The landing would be fast and dangerous. Johnson touched down at 130 miles per hour, far above normal landing speed. The Thunderbolt bounced, touched again, rolled nearly a mile before friction slowed it enough that Johnson could ground loop the aircraft to a stop. Ground crews counted the damage. 21 20mm cannon shell impacts. More than 200 machine gun bullet holes. The hydraulic system destroyed. Rudder controls damaged. Tail surfaces shredded. Electrical system partially failed. But the engine ran perfectly. The wings remained intact. The landing gear functioned. The armor had protected the pilot. The aircraft had brought him home. Johnson's experience became legendary within the 56th Fighter Group, but it also illustrated something important about the P-47's design philosophy. Republic Aviation had built the Thunderbolt to absorb tremendous damage and continue flying. The radial engine could lose cylinders and maintain power. The airframe could sustain battle damage that would destroy other fighters. Armor plate protected critical systems and the pilot. This ruggedness, combined with dive performance, created a tactical environment where American pilots could attack aggressively, knowing that even if they took damage, they had excellent chances of surviving. German pilots attacking bombers found themselves having to choose between pressing their attacks and defending against diving P-47 seconds. If they focused on bombers, American fighters dove on them from above. If they focused on defending against American fighters, the bombers proceeded to their targets unmolested. By August 1943, the 56th Fighter Group had become the highest-scoring P-47 unit in the 8th Air Force. Their tactics had been adopted by other groups. The Thunderbolt was no longer viewed as a problematic aircraft. It was recognized as the most effective bomber escort available. October 1943 brought the ultimate demonstration of dive tactics. The 8th Air Force launched a series of deep penetration raids into Germany, targeting ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and other critical industrial targets. Luftwaffe resistance was ferocious. On October 14th, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single day during the second Schweinfurt raid. Fighter escorts could not accompany the bombers all the way to target due to fuel limitations. The losses were unsustainable. But during October, when P-47 seconds were available to escort bombers, German losses exceeded American losses by substantial margins. The 56th Fighter Group alone claimed 39 German aircraft destroyed during the month, while losing only one Thunderbolt. The group's kill ratio for October was 39-1. Much of this success came from systematic application of dive attacks. The tactical evolution continued. Pilots discovered that diving attacks could be executed in multiple ways depending on circumstances. If German fighters were below the American formation, diving attacks from altitude worked perfectly. If German fighters approached at co-altitude, American pilots could execute a maneuver called the split S. Roll inverted, pull through into a dive, accelerate to escape speed, then zoom, climb back to altitude from a different position. If German fighters approached from above, attempting their own diving attacks, American pilots could pull their P-47 seconds into steep climbs, bleeding off speed deliberately. As the climbing Thunderbolt slowed to 200 miles per hour, the pilot would roll and pull into a dive, just as the attacking German fighter committed to his run. The German pilot would find himself overshooting, unable to slow quickly enough at high speed, presenting a perfect target for the diving P-47 that now positioned behind him. These tactics required precise energy management. Pilots needed to understand airspeed, altitude, and position relative to both enemies and friendlies at all times. They needed to calculate whether they had sufficient altitude to dive, sufficient speed to zoom climb, sufficient fuel to continue fighting. The cognitive load was enormous. Pilots who made mistakes died, but those who mastered energy fighting became extraordinarily effective. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe's tactical instructions warned pilots that engaging P-47 seconds in any form of vertical combat was dangerous. German fighters were instructed to avoid diving away from pursuing Thunderbolts, avoid climbing when P-47 seconds held altitude advantage, and avoid turning fights at high speeds where Thunderbolts could convert superior roll rate into firing solutions. Effectively, the Luftwaffe was admitting they had no good tactical answer to the P-47 when flown properly. If American pilots maintained discipline, stayed at altitude, dove only when targets presented themselves, and zoomed back to position after attacks, German fighters could not counter them effectively. The transformation was complete by early 1944. The aircraft that had been derided as too heavy, too slow climbing, too clumsy for dogfighting, had become the primary air superiority fighter over Western Europe. The key was recognizing that dogfighting was obsolete when you could dive at 550 miles per hour. March 6, 1944, brought the culmination of everything the 56th Fighter Group had developed over the previous year. The mission was bomber escort to Berlin, the first time American fighters had escorted bombers all the way to the German capital. Extended-range fuel tanks made the mission possible. Dive tactics made it successful. The 56th Fighter Group launched 48 P-47Ds, the latest model with paddle blade propellers that improved climb performance. Lieutenant Colonel Zemke led from the front. At 28,000 feet over Brandenburg, they encountered the largest German fighter force yet engaged. More than 80 Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs rose to attack the bomber formation. Zemke did not wait for the Germans to attack. He rolled his flight onto their backs and dove. From 28,000 feet to 20,000 feet in seconds, airspeed climbed past 500 miles per hour. The formation of Messerschmitts climbing toward the bombers never saw the attack coming. Zemke fired on the leading aircraft from 400 yards. The Messerschmitt exploded. Behind him, every flight in the 56th Fighter Group executed similar attacks. P-47 seconds dove from altitude onto German fighters positioned below. The dive speed was so great that German pilots had no time to react. They scattered, attempting to escape, but found American fighters matching their every maneuver. German pilots who dove away were followed by faster diving Thunderbolts. German pilots who tried to climb found P-47 seconds zooming past them, firing as they climbed. The engagement lasted 20 minutes. When it ended, the 56th Fighter Group claimed 11 German aircraft destroyed without losing a single Thunderbolt. Not a single bomber in the formation they escorted was shot down. The success was total, and it was achieved entirely through systematic application of dive attacks from altitude. German pilots who survived the engagement filed reports describing American fighters that could dive faster than anything the Luftwaffe flew, that maintained control at speeds where German aircraft became unmanageable, and that could zoom climb so effectively that pursuit was futile. One Luftwaffe intelligence report from March 1944 concluded that American P-47 pilots had mastered vertical combat to such a degree that engaging them required numerical superiority of at least 3-1. The dive tactics developed by Zemke and the 56th Fighter Group spread throughout the 8th Air Force and then to other theaters. P-47 groups in Italy adopted similar tactics. Units in the Pacific, where Colonel Neil Kirby had independently developed comparable techniques with the 348th Fighter Group, found that boom and zoom attacks worked against Japanese fighters even more effectively than against German aircraft. The cumulative impact transformed the air war. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe could no longer contest American daylight bomber operations over Western Europe. German fighter losses exceeded replacement capacity. Experienced pilots were killed faster than new pilots could be trained. The P-47, flying dive attacks from altitude, destroyed German fighters in ratios exceeding 4-1. Statistical analysis supports what pilots experienced. Between April 1943 and May 1944, P-47 units in the European theatre claimed 3,822 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, while losing 824 Thunderbolts to all causes. The overall kill ratio was 4.6-1. For groups that most effectively utilized dive tactics, including the 56th Fighter Group, kill ratios exceeded 6-1. These numbers represented more than tactical success. They represented strategic impact. Every German fighter destroyed was one less threat to bomber formations. Every bomber that reached its target contributed to degrading German industrial capacity. Every German pilot killed was experience that could not be replaced. The dive attacks, executed thousands of times by hundreds of pilots, accumulated into air superiority, and it was all made possible by recognizing that conventional fighter tactics were irrelevant when you could dive faster than the enemy could escape. The P-47's 7-ton weight became its greatest asset. The turbocharger that added complexity and limited maneuverability enabled operations at altitudes where dives could build tremendous energy. The structural strength that made the aircraft expensive to produce meant it could reach speeds that would destroy lighter airframes. By late 1944, when P-51 Mustangs with longer range began replacing P-47 seconds in some escort roles, the Thunderbolt's reputation was secure. The 56th Fighter Group refused to transition to Mustangs, preferring to continue flying Thunderbolts despite opportunities to switch. Colonel David Schilling, who succeeded Zemke as group commander, stated that the P-47's dive performance and ruggedness made it superior for their mission, despite the Mustang's longer range and better high-altitude maneuverability. The group's preference was vindicated by results. The 56th Fighter Group finished the war as the top-scoring P-47 unit with 551 aerial victories. The unit claimed 677.5 total victories, including ground kills. No other fighter group in the 8th Air Force exceeded the 56th's aerial kill count, regardless of aircraft type flown. The dive tactics that made this success possible required no special equipment. The P-47D-25 that flew the Berlin mission on March 6, 1944, had the same dive performance as the P-47C that Johnson had flown when shot up in June 1943. What changed was pilot understanding of how to exploit that performance. Doctrine, not technology, transformed the Thunderbolt from liability to asset. German perspective on American dive tactics provides important context. Luftwaffe fighter pilot Günter Rahl, who survived the war with 275 victories, stated in post-war interviews that P-47 pilots who understood their aircraft's capabilities were among the most dangerous opponents he faced. Rahl noted that early in 1943, German pilots viewed the Thunderbolt as easy prey. By late 1943, they actively avoided engaging P-47 seconds that held altitude advantage. Major Heinz Baer, another high-scoring German ace, commented that the P-47's ability to absorb damage and continue fighting made it more difficult to shoot down than any other Allied fighter. Even when German pilots achieved good firing positions and scored hits, the Thunderbolt often flew home. Combined with American numerical superiority and improved tactics, this resilience created a tactical environment where German pilots faced increasingly unfavorable odds. The physics of why the P-47 dove so effectively deserve explanation. Terminal velocity in a dive is determined by the balance between gravitational force and wind resistance. Gravitational force increases with mass. Wind resistance increases with frontal area and the square of velocity. The P-47's mass exceeded most other fighters by substantial margins, while its frontal area, though large, was not proportionally greater. This meant the Thunderbolt's weight-to-drag ratio favored high terminal velocities. Where a 6,000-pound fighter might reach terminal velocity at 450 miles per hour, the 12,000-pound P-47 reached terminal velocity near 600 miles per hour. In practical combat situations, where dives lasted seconds rather than minutes, the P-47 could build speed faster than lighter aircraft. The structural strength to withstand high-speed flight came from Republic's engineering conservatism. The P-47 was designed with ultimate load factors exceeding 12 G, twice the minimum required by Army specifications. Wing spars were over-engineered. Fuselage formers had redundant load paths. The result was an aircraft that could dive to speeds approaching compressibility without structural failure, provided the pilot recovered properly. Control response at high speeds came from Republic's attention to aerodynamic balance. The P-47's ailerons used internal balancing tabs that reduced control forces at high speeds. The elevator was large enough to remain effective even when airflow began separating at transonic speeds. These features meant pilots could maintain control through the full speed range from stall to compressibility, giving them confidence to dive aggressively. The zoom climb after attacks came from energy conversion. An aircraft moving at 500 miles per hour at 15,000 feet altitude has both kinetic energy from its velocity and potential energy from its height. If the pilot pulls into a climb, kinetic energy converts to potential energy as speed decreases and altitude increases. The P-47's heavy weight, which stored more kinetic energy at a given speed than lighter aircraft, meant it could climb higher before energy depleted. Pilots learned to manage this energy carefully. A zoom climb at too steep an angle would bleed speed quickly, leaving the aircraft vulnerable at the top of the climb. A zoom climb at too shallow an angle would not gain sufficient altitude. The optimal angle varied with entry speed, but generally fell between 45 and 60 degrees above horizontal. Pilots who mastered energy management could routinely zoom from 15,000 feet back to 25,000 feet after high-speed attack runs. These techniques required practice and discipline. Young pilots joining P-47 units in 1944 received extensive training in dive attacks and zoom climbs before flying combat missions. Experienced pilots mentored newcomers, explaining how to calculate dive angles, when to pull out, how to manage airspeed in zoom climbs. The 56th Fighter Group developed training exercises where flights would practice attacks against each other, building muscle memory and tactical instincts. The human factor was critical. Diving at 500 miles per hour toward the Earth while maintaining tactical awareness, selecting targets, calculating firing solutions, and planning recovery required extraordinary concentration. Pilots operated at the edge of physical and mental capacity. G-forces during pullouts from dives and zoom climbs caused greyouts and sometimes blackouts. The cognitive load of managing energy, monitoring instruments, maintaining formation discipline, and tracking multiple enemy aircraft simultaneously was enormous. Yet hundreds of pilots mastered these skills. Robert Johnson flew 91 combat missions, all in P-47 seconds, and claimed 27 victories. Francis Gabreski flew the P-47 throughout his combat tour and claimed 28 aerial victories, making him the top American ace in Europe flying a single aircraft type. Walker Mahurin claimed 21 victories in P-47 seconds. Dozens of other pilots became aces flying Thunderbolts. Their success came from understanding a fundamental truth. Air combat was not about turning performance or rate of climb or maximum speed at any particular altitude. It was about energy management. The aircraft with superior energy state, whether from altitude, speed, or both, held tactical advantage. The P-47's dive performance meant it could convert altitude into speed faster than any opponent, and then convert that speed back into altitude more effectively than most aircraft. German pilots who survived the war consistently mentioned American energy tactics as among the most difficult to counter. Traditional fighter combat involved maneuvering for position through turning and climbing. Against American pilots executing dive attacks from altitude, these maneuvers were ineffective. By the time a German pilot recognized the threat and began maneuvering, the diving P-47 had already fired and was zooming away. The legacy of P-47 dive tactics extended beyond World War II. Post-war fighter development incorporated lessons learned about energy fighting. The emphasis on acceleration, dive performance, and zoom climb capability influenced designs throughout the jet age. The F-86 Sabre, which used boom and zoom tactics effectively in Korea, reflected many of the same principles Zemke had developed with the Thunderbolt. But perhaps the most important legacy was demonstrating that tactical innovation could overcome technological limitations. The P-47 never became a superior turning fighter. It never outclimbed German fighters at low altitude. It never achieved the maximum speed of late-war German designs. Yet it dominated the air war over Europe through systematic application of tactics that exploited its unique strengths. This lesson remains relevant. Military organizations often focus on developing better technology, seeking aircraft or weapons with superior specifications. The P-47 experience suggests that understanding how to employ existing capabilities effectively may be more important than waiting for perfect technology. The Thunderbolt pilots who dove from 28,000 feet at 550 miles per hour were not flying superior aircraft. They were flying their aircraft superiorly. The final statistics tell the story. P-47 Thunderbolts flew 746,000 sorties in all theaters during World War II. They destroyed 3,822 enemy aircraft in aerial combat. They destroyed enemy ground targets, including more than 6,000 armored vehicles, 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railway cars, and 68,000 trucks. Total production exceeded 15,600 aircraft. Only the P-51 Mustang exceeded this production among American fighters. But the Mustang's longer range should not obscure the Thunderbolt's accomplishment. During the critical period from spring 1943 through spring 1944, when the air battle over Europe hung in balance, the P-47 was the primary American fighter achieving air superiority. The dive tactics that made this possible were developed through systematic analysis of the aircraft's capabilities, relentless training, and courageous execution by pilots who trusted their doctrine even when instinct suggested otherwise. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.